Hi, everyone. My name is Emmy Amarati, and I'm Assistant Director of our ACU Online Writing Center. I'm thrilled to be working today with Dr. Tanya Hart, one of our professional writing tutors. Say hi, Tanya.
Hi, Tanya. No, seriously. Hey, everybody.
Today's webinar is part one in a series of two webinars on the topic of writing a rhetorical analysis. We'll be posting the links to the recording and the slide deck for the webinar to our Online Writing Center website, and the links to the resources in the slide deck will be active. We'll also be releasing part two of the series next week. For this first webinar on rhetorical analysis, these are our learning objectives. By the end of the session, we will understand the purpose and process of rhetorical analysis and workshop APCO 311 Week 2, Assignment 1, Understanding and Evaluating Rhetorical Analysis and Description. To start, Tanya is going to take us through Learning Objective 1, Understand the Purpose and Process of Rhetorical Analysis.
Thanks so much, Emmy, for setting this up, for the introduction. Hey, everybody. Okay, we're going to look at rhetorical analysis today, APCO 311. This is week 2, session number 1. So, what is rhetoric? And I'm going to be breaking off here and there to I want to really just cement you guys into understanding and being comfortable with the term rhetoric and being able to use it. So in Stoner, he defines rhetoric as messages relying on verbal and nonverbal symbols that more or less intentionally influence social attitudes, values, beliefs, and actions. And he also says that rhetorical acts, artifacts, texts, and discourse exist within context. In other words, they need to be situated. Okay, so what's going on? What's the time? What's the place? Is there an event? Is something changing? Who are the people who are constructing this, the authors? Who are they speaking to? You guys are going to be an audience for this assignment. So, an audience. Also, social attitudes. The big thing that I want to break down here is be comfortable with rhetoric. Think about it as neither positive nor negative. Okay. Some people today, you talk to people and you mention rhetoric. Oh, rhetoric, that's negative. That's, rhetoric bad. I don't know what is good, what the opposite is with it, but rhetoric bad. And it's like, no, no, no. Instead, look at rhetoric just as humans, what we do, how we use verbal and nonverbal means to try to get other humans, other human beings, to listen to us and to maybe pay attention to what we're saying and to perhaps even agree on what we're saying or doing based on how credibly we lay out reasons or supports for what we want to convince people to believe. Okay, let me run through that again. Rhetoric isn't positive, it's not negative, it is totally neutral. It's what humans use just to be able to talk to each other, to lay out something, to lay out an argument, to describe something and communicate it in a way that you, as my audience, are going to listen to me, pay attention to me, maybe even, you know, uh, is this worth examining? Is this worth listening to? Is this worth believing? That's rhetoric. And there are steps, there are processes to go through. And this is what we're going to be talking about to get you ready for this assignment. So, since we plowed through rhetoric and it's not scary anymore, what then is rhetorical analysis? So, Stoner 2020 talks about how rhetorical analysis is looking at and understanding how authors or speakers craft rhetorical messages to influence their audience. Okay. If you want to think about this broadly, if you're into social media, I don't know, maybe what sites or what, webcasts or podcasts or whatever you listen to, but there are rhetorical devices that the authors, the speakers use to be able to craft messages so that they can go about influencing their audience. Okay. So this is kind of like, the man behind the screen or the Wizard of Oz, the guy behind the curtain. That's what we're getting into today with rhetorical analysis. Second, rhetorical analysis means systematically examining messages to determine the parts of the messages, so breaking things apart, and then looking at them. Do they work together? Okay. Are they functioning correctly? Are they fighting each other? Is something really taking out something else when it should be a cohesive message? What's the meaning in this? What is the value? And this is really important. Practicing rhetorical analysis helps us to become better judges and better creators of messages in a day-to-day setting. So let's go back broadly. Okay. This is humanity. These are humans that we're dealing with, and we've got reasons and ways for saying what we believe. Okay, our thoughts, our perceptions. We learn to articulate these through using rhetorical devices. Now, let me come out of out from under my sheet here. Okay, I am a social historian. I'm a trained historian. I am a historian of US women. Okay, and in the past, when I've taught students, I've always focused on getting them to go deeper. Don't just view things, don't just review an essay, a book, or whatever, a photo even from the surface. Go deeper. Look rhetorically. Develop rhetorically honed senses to try to analyze what people are saying or writing. Go deeper. So just hearing on the surface and then deciding to believe or reject something without analyzing it, that's just risky. And that's what I would argue too many people are prone to do today. Okay. So this is something that we can develop. You guys develop as students, Emmy and I as instructors, all of us as human beings to become better judges of everything that's going on now around us. So rhetorical analysis just means taking what you see or hear on the surface and then kick it up a notch. Actually look into it, actually examine and analyze what authors say, what speakers say, why they're saying it, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. That's what it means to do rhetorical analysis. Okay, let's go back to Stoner 2020. This is the basis for this assignment and also for your training in rhetoric and rhetorical analysis. So, this is a simple one. What's the process of rhetoric in terms of Stoner? Four things. First, describe. Second, analyze. Third, interpret. Fourth, and finally, evaluate. Now, you're looking at this and you're like, oh, good grief, this is fine. There's just four things to remember. Like, don't blink at this slide and say, okay, yeah, and then move on. I'm going to linger here for a moment, okay, because people can make this process become something that's a part of everyday life. I've already discussed that. But the steps here are critical and they don't work as well if you don't follow them in this order. Describe, analyze, interpret, and evaluate. Okay, let me go back again. Rhetoric is neutral. It's not positive, it's not negative. Okay, so think neutrally and logically when applying rhetorical analysis. It's really important not to get these steps out of order. Okay, for example, you're going to be listening to a podcast where an interviewer is going to be talking to four rhetors. Rhetors or people who know and are adept at practicing rhetoric. Okay, these are people who are well educated, they are well trained, they are trained within their fields, they're also historically trained. So they're coming from a bunch of different places. As you listen to the podcast for this assignment and you hear something you don't understand or don't agree with, look at that decision that you just made. I don't like that. I don't understand it. I don't agree with it. Why? Have you jumped to evaluate something without stopping to take time to run the statement or the example through that process that Stoner's talking about? Describe, analyze, interpret, and then finally evaluate. Okay? So make sure that you take your time and run through things specifically in that order. This is what learning how to think critically is supposed to teach us, flawed humans, flawed as we are, to do, to be able to follow through and take steps and say, okay, have I jumped to evaluate something without stopping to take time to run through the statement and look at the description? Did I understand what was being described? Analysis. Do I see and understand where the person's coming from, where she or he bases her or his statement from? That's analysis. And then evaluation. Have I let my assessment of description and analysis get me to the point where I can actually make a sound, cogent, accurate interpretation? Don't jump through steps and get to evaluate. In this assignment, you're going to have to go through each step, and I'm going to walk you through each step. But just get ready to follow the process, follow the steps. So let's focus on next description and analysis. This is very easy. The first parts, according to Stoner, is focusing on describe. How is something being described? Okay. This seems self-evident almost. It's like, duh, but these aren't really easily learned. Description and analysis requires taking the time to see and describe something in ways that get your point across. Remember, again, I'm going to keep hitting on this. Rhetoric at its base is neutral. It's not negative or positive, but it's how we humans communicate to try to persuade others that what we're saying is worth listening to and analyzing and agreeing with. Okay, so that's description. Then analysis requires a speaker or a writer to have analyzed her or his position to the point of accurately describing a situation, doing an analysis, and then sitting back and just putting it all out there for everybody, for audiences, for people to hear, to see, to critique whether they're going to end up being in agreement or in disagreement. So let's get deeper into what it means to describe. Stoner on page 44 says, to describe something means to characterize a message under analysis by identifying rhetorical devices, patterns of use, and message structures to forego qualities of a message fundamental to its function and outcome as rhetoric. So this is a systematic description of parts, not just a regurgitation, okay? Not just a retelling of something. In description within rhetorical analysis, the author or the speaker has to remember that she or he has tools available to them to get their descriptions across, to better get the descriptions across to their audiences, to better get one's point across. Let me a building. Okay, let's say you're going to make a building or a house or something like that. So it's like you're trying to build a house when you're trying to describe something rhetorically. Things come together successfully bit by bit, piece by piece, not all at once. You have to use the right tools, you have to use the right materials. Then the edifice, or in terms of Stoner, the description, whatever the author or the writer is trying to build, comes together for the audience, the viewers, the listeners, to see, to listen to decide, is this worth it or not? And then to be able to evaluate. So let's go deeper. Describe. What do you need to do? Well, first, in rhetorical analysis, you have to describe the context. Again, things aren't just floating in space, y'all. Okay. Think time. What's the era? What's the decade? What's going on? What's the place? Where is this occurring? Things don't happen in a vacuum. What's the environment? What's going on? Is it an event? Again, what's the event? What's the importance? Who is invited? How you get in? Yeah. What's in, that's very important, especially with inaugural addresses, like, what's going on in your assignment. The audience, who's the people who are listening? And with social media, with the internet, you can all not always control who your audience will be. Keep that in the back of your mind as you do your rhetorical analysis. Also, think of culture, think of social attitudes. What's going on again in the environment that permeates into this description? Second, when you describe how the text interacts within the context of time, place, events, authors, audiences, and social attitudes. Does the text conform? In other words, if you want to see a reflection of that top line, number one, time, place, events, authors, audiences, social attitudes, does the text, does the description conform to this, or does it disrupt? Does it desecrate? Does it reconstruct? Does it take what's above and really counter and reconstruct it in a different manner? Or does it not even participate? Is it giving you an alternative? These are things to think about when you describe and you're doing historical, well, that's one device, but a rhetorical analysis. Analyze. Stoner says that analysis or analyzing is, quote, the process of systematically discovering, identifying, and articulating the various parts of the message and the relationship to those parts relating to one another. So again, look at things connecting and what's around it. The whole issue of description, the time, the event, the place, what's going on, what's the social context, what are the attitudes. These, when you analyze, see how they fit together. Okay, see how the parts and patterns interact to create effects within the audience. These are some of the tools after you look at the description you put together for analysis. What does that which you've seen from a writer or heard from a speaker actually mean? Within the larger context, what is going on as you analyze? What does it mean? What do these words, when they're brought together, convey to readers, convey to hearers, convey to the audience? What works? When you analyze, what works? What doesn't? What kind of sticks in your stomach like, oh, and why does it sticking there? Again, why and how? In analysis, you're looking at the author, you're looking at the speaker. Why are they using these terms? Why are they using these methods? Why are they using these rhetorical devices? And then how are they working? The second part of analysis, okay, and this is where things get narrow. Okay, we're coming down out of the rafters of rhetorical analysis and just looking at things and oh, time and place and events and oh, that's nice. Now we got to get narrow. So first, you got to name the parts of the message. You've got to be able to articulate, take apart, and using specific rhetorical models or general knowledge, look at the parts of the message. Then look for patterns, rhetorical patterns. Is the person repeating something? Okay. How is the person sequencing dates, sequencing timing, sequencing events? Is she or he admitting something that you know about or should be taken into consideration? Getting narrow. Now, you're going to be doing I mean, not historical, but rhetorical analysis. I'm a historian speaking from my perspective. You're going to be doing rhetorical analysis and you're going to have to get narrow here. For your own critical analysis, this means dissecting. This means getting into this this podcast that you're going to be listening to, getting into the four speakers, the four rhetors who are speaking. And you're not going to be trying to just offhandedly blow up and destroy each of their messages just for the heck of doing it. But maybe think of it like peeling an onion. Okay. Hopefully you won't cry. But peel away as peel away aspects of the writers or of their descriptions, okay, and try to get down to what they're trying to get across. Again, these are very highly accomplished, educated historians who know about inaugural addresses, okay? Look at what they're trying to get across and look at the levels that they may or may not use or recognize. Again, remember, you're learning how to use the steps, but in learning how to use the steps, you are looking at and evaluating professionals and how they are using the rhetorical steps to set up their own rhetorical analysis. They're using steps, they're using processes of rhetorical analyses that some people know and use, and that they themselves know and use. But once you let the cat out of the bag, you can't always control the outcomes. Like I said before, audience is something that you have to consider when doing a rhetorical analysis or speaking rhetorically. But with social media and the internet, you don't always know who your audience is going to be. So let's go into APCO 311, week two, assignment one. Let's look at this.
So Tanya just reviewed the basics of describing and analyzing rhetoric according to Stoner, and honestly, I could listen to Tanya lecture all day. But now we're going to consider how we're going to apply the basics she described in our APCO 311 course on rhetorical analysis. Our specific focus is week 2, assignment 1, understanding and evaluating rhetorical analysis and description. And for the next few slides, we're going to read through that assignment.
Thanks so much, Emmy. Okay, the preamble. This is the why. If you don't get this, you're in trouble. I'm serious. This is the why behind the assignment. You have to understand this. So the purpose, the goal of this assignment is to further understand the process of critically thinking about a rhetorical message by evaluating an example of rhetorical analysis. Okay, you're going to learn how to critically think through and how to craft your own rhetorical analysis by looking at people who craft rhetorical messages and evaluating them. This is not an assignment where you're going to be evaluating the 2020 inaugural address of President Joe Biden. No, that's not happening. That's not what you're given in your prompt. That's not what you're giving in the preamble or the purpose behind the assignment. You are critiquing the critiquers. You are listening to a podcast where there is an interviewer interviewing for rhetors, for people who are consumers and propagators or whatever of rhetoric, who are doing their own rhetorical analyses of the 2020 presidential Joe Biden inaugural address. And then you are critiquing what the critiquers have done. Get this, you're critiquing the critiquers. So the instructions first. That's what I've been talking about. There are four scholars, four renowned scholars discussing a recent presidential inaugural address, hint, hint, 2020, President Biden. And you're asked to write a 2 to 3 page paper on questions. So you've got the assignment, You're going to be critiquing the critiquers. Listen to the podcast. These are four scholars who are schooled in rhetoric. You're going to be critiquing the critiquers. Okay. What are the questions? Well, first, what were three rhetorical elements the scholars discussed? Now, if you go back to Stoner, do your homework, read through Stoner, he goes through several rhetorical elements. You're only asked or told to use three. So you're going to have to, based on what you see, based on your evaluation, based on, again, description, analysis, uh, you know, all of those things, you're going to have to come up with three rhetorical elements. What do you think you gained an understanding? Was it sufficient of the rhetorical elements in the inaugural address? Specifically, did the scholars A, adequately communicate the relationship between parts of the message identified in the description? And B, did they uncover rhetorical choices and how those choices relate both to the speaker themselves, the rhetor, and to the audience? And then, how could you improve on the scholar's analyses? So basically, yeah, go through this. Look at the rhetors, listen to them based on your take of the podcast and your critique of them and their messages. What are you going to take away? What did they communicate to you? What did you sufficiently understand? How did they structure it? What rhetorical elements? You got to use three. What are the three rhetorical elements that stood out that the scholars discussed? Second, as a critiquer, how would you go about improving their analyses? And remember, you got four folks, not just one, not just two, you got four. Okay, so you're going to have to work through this very carefully. How would you improve on their analyses and why? After going through and deciding the three rhetorical elements, how did they communicate? Was it given sufficiently? Did you understand the rhetorical elements? Did they communicate adequately the relationship between the parts of the message? Were there things that they should have talked about or they didn't talk about, or maybe they didn't realize they were talking about that they shouldn't have talked about? Go through and do your analysis. What did they miss? What would you have handled differently? Remember, you are analyzing the analyzers. And then finally, format your submission using APA guidelines. Yeah. And also, Emily is like Sherlock Holmes. She's amazing. She found a podcast transcript. So for, you're listening, or if you're hearing impaired or whatever, there is also a readable transcript here that you can use for the podcast.
Yep, and in our slide deck, this link will be active, so you can click the link to get to the transcript. And now we're going to
Woo-hoo.
take a couple, yeah, super helpful for me because I can't follow along when people are talking. It goes right through my head, and I need to be able to see what is being said at the same time.
Amen.
So we're going to take a couple of minutes now to look at the assignment rubric and see how its criteria relate to the questions from the assignment. So your first 30 points of the 100-point assignment total relate to the criterion of discussing at least three rhetorical elements of the inauguration as addressed in the podcast. Next, 25 points is for explaining your understanding of the description and analysis of rhetorical elements in the inaugural address, as discussed in the podcast. And 15 points is for providing evaluation of the analysis. These two criteria don't directly match the language or order of questions in your assignment description, so we're going to break it down to figure out what questions from the prompt these two criteria actually reflect. So they're coming from the second assignment question. Do you think you gained a sufficient understanding of the rhetorical elements of the inaugural address? And specifically, did the scholars adequately communicate the relationship between the parts of the message identified in the description and uncover rhetorical choices and how those choices relate to both the speaker, rhetor, and the audience. The part about description is going to be revealed as you explain the relationship between the parts of the message identified, meaning how the podcasters describe the parts of the message of the inaugural address. Your understanding of analysis will be revealed as you discuss rhetorical choices and how those choices relate to both the speaker, rhetor, and the audience. In other words, how the podcasters analyze the rhetorical choices of the inaugural address. The part about evaluation is coming from the top question. Do you think you gained sufficient understanding of the inaugural address based on the podcaster's description and analysis? Then, as Tanya said before, based on your evaluation, you need to provide suggestions for improvement. That's 15 points. And the last 15 points is for following the guidelines of crafting a 2 to 3 page paper, following your APA format, and making sure you go include in-text citations and a references page. We're going to address citing and referencing later, but right now we get to listen to Tanya again. Yay! And she's going to provide some hints for organizing and developing the draft.
Okay, this is really, really basic. Again, 3 rhetorical elements. There are many, okay, that you can choose from. Only choose 3. Don't go into 4, don't go down to 2. 3, what were they? What are the ones that stuck out? What are the ones that the scholars discussed? Second, do you really think you gained a sufficient understanding of the elements of the inaugural address? Again, you're not critiquing Joe Biden's 2020 inaugural address. You are critiquing the rhetor's rhetorical analysis, the elements that they use to be able to explain to you, or in their attempt to explain and get you to buy into what they're saying, of that inaugural address. Specifically, did the scholars adequately communicate the relationship between the parts of the message identified in the description? And were they uncovering rhetorical choices? And how did those choices relate to both the speaker and the audience? And can you improve? Could you improve on their analyses? Could you improve on what they did? Okay. Now, in terms of setting up the paper, you've got 4 major things to think about. First, the rhetorical element. So you could structure your paper. You've only got 2 to 3 pages to work with. Okay, so this is going to have to be tight. I mean, this is going to have to be squeaky tight. Okay, 3 rhetorical elements that you're going to talk about that the scholars discussed. So in a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, discuss the 3 rhetorical elements and how the scholars dealt with them. Or you could do an element per paragraph, 3 paragraphs. That's something you could do. Second, in terms of the description of the inaugural address, how well did they communicate the relationship between the parts that they're talking about within the inauguration, how they go through and they're analyzing them and they're explaining things. And some of them are going back to George Washington's inaugural and Thomas Jefferson's inaugural and FDR and JFK. And okay, so how are they bringing all these things together in their description of Joe Biden's inaugural address? Another paragraph could be an analysis of the inaugural address. What are the rhetorical choices, and how do those choices that they have made relate both to them as speakers with their backgrounds? You're given full, not full, but very, very adequate revelatory backgrounds on each one of these professors, what they teach, where they teach, what they published. They're going to talk about their writings. They're going to talk about what they're bringing to the table in terms of their analysis. How does that work? Talk about that. And then finally, in your conclusion, What are things where they can improve? How would you improve? What are suggestions for improvement? If you were sitting at the table and the interviewer was talking to you, if you were the rhetor, what are things that you would have said? Okay, so these are things to take into consideration and as far as major headings for your paper. And again, you can't get fancy. You've only got 2 to 3 pages. So remember, summarize your understanding of the inaugural address. Again, you are not yourself evaluating Joe Biden's 2020 presidential inaugural address. You are critiquing the critiquers. You are looking at rhetors who have gone through, people who are professionally trained, they're outstanding professors. They speak and they write on these things all the time, and they were brought together in this podcast to be interviewed to give their take on what they see in this inaugural address. You are critiquing the critiquers. So summarize your understanding of the inaugural address based on the description and analysis from the podcasters and not on your own perceptions of the address. So, description. Let's walk through this. Apply description. Okay. What is each person describing? What are the speakers' differing backgrounds? They're coming from all types of different places, different genders, different races. They're okay. They're not all the same. How do you think their backgrounds and training influence their descriptive perspectives? There are a lot of things, a lot of different ways that they could have chosen, each of them, to come to bring their rhetoric across. How do their backgrounds and their training influence what they say? Second, what are the rhetorical devices? Again, going back to Stoner, patterns of use, the message structures to foreground qualities of message. How are these fundamental to its function and outcome as rhetoric? And you got 5 people. You've got the interviewer who also makes comments, and then the 4 scholars. How does all of this work together? How do they believe this speech fits, this inaugural speech fits within the past context of other inaugural speeches? So they're not just looking at the 2020 presidential inaugural speech as a one-off. Okay, they're not looking at it as just like, oh, let's just say what he said. No, they're looking at it critically within the context of hundreds, couple hundreds of years of inaugural addresses. Now, realize that these 4 people being interviewed for their descriptions of the 2020 inaugural speech, again, they're trained and they're public educators. So, what's their rhetorical conception of inaugural speeches? How does each go about describing the context of the inaugural speeches? Do they just do it narrowly or do they do it broadly? What are these speeches they're talking about? When did they start? When did they occur? What's their importance? What does this speech mean that from 2020 within the context of these other speeches? What do these and the other descriptions they give? What do they give to you in terms of building or desecrating their message? Because once you put something out there, once you open Pandora's box and you speak it into social media with social context, you can't control it. Okay. So does it actually build or does it desecrate the message that they're trying to construct? Place close attention to the things that they're saying in terms of analysis. How do the points come together within each person's analysis? And then Stoner indicated that rhetorical analysts must address specifics. How do the podcasters handle specifics? Hmm? Remember and make sure to articulate and get narrow. Analyze specific examples in the words to show how they use these rhetorical elements. Then explain what works and what doesn't work. So look closely at their words. How do things come together or not? How does their analysis come together? What works? What's rhetorically cohesive? Does this create a rhetorically cohesive podcast analysis? So realize that you're doing this critical depth of interpretation and analysis, and that you're now entering into the realm of specifics. Like I said, you're coming up to the table, you're taking a seat at the table of rhetorical analysis. Check to make sure that you're able to see, you're able to analyze, you're able to articulate specific examples in the words of these speakers to show how they use rhetorical models to strengthen the points they're trying to get across. Also, when you, as now an author, yeah, you're now an author, when you get to the point of getting into specifics, start thinking about what works and what doesn't work in their words, and then be able to explain and show why you think some things are a hit or a miss as you, as now an author, now move into the world of rhetor or rhetorical analyzer as you're critiquing the critiques. You're the critiquer now. So you've got to be specific. Finally, again, I don't want to beat this too hard, but I got to because I spent too long in a classroom. You've only got 2 to 3 pages for your critique. So you're going to have to get narrow. You're going to have to be succinct. You're going to have to get specific. Control your own rhetoric. Okay. As you've seen in your analysis of this podcast, the rhetors must make every word that they say count. They are limited to time. You are limited to space. So, as a rhetor in training, this is what you also should do. Just think of it like you've just got a limited amount of space, you've got a limited amount of time. Make each word count.
Thanks, Tanya. After listening to you, I think I want to go write this paper myself because I'm super motivated.
Go on with your
Uh,
bad self.
awesome. I would love to write this one. Um, but for you student writers out there, you readers in training, if you would like assistance setting up your draft
Mhm.
in APA format, we invite you to use our ACU APA course paper template, which the Online Writing Center has developed. That way you won't have to worry about font or spacing or heading format or things like that because it is all built in to our template. And from our slide deck, you can click this link to get to the template. And now we're going to take a few minutes to go over some points about citation and referencing in APA format because that's an important part of your assignment too. So for this module, you're assigned 3 chapters from your textbook, and the textbook was written by one author. So we're going to look at how to write the reference for a whole authored book. A whole authored book means that one author wrote the entire book themselves. So we're going to write the reference for a whole authored book. First, you put the author's last name and first initials, also middle initials if they give it, but Stoner only has his first initial. Next, we put the year of publication in parentheses. The title of the book goes in italics and sentence case. Sentence case means that we're going to capitalize only the first words of the title and subtitle. So here we just have the M capitalized and the A at the beginning of the subtitle. If you have addition information, as we do for the Stoner text, we'll put that in parentheses after the title. Here we have second, which we write out as 2ND. And for addition, we put ED followed by a period. And last, we put the name of the publisher. Once we've written the reference, we also know how to cite in text because APA applies a format that we call author date citation. For a paraphrase, that means you can just name the author and the year in parentheses, separated by a comma, at the end of the sentence that contains the borrowed idea. So here's a sentence paraphrase from Stoner. Each rhetorical artifact exists within its own context of rhetor, audience, time, place, events, and social conditions and attitudes. I have Stoner, comma, 2020 in parentheses at the end. You can also name the author in your sentence and follow their name immediately with the year in parentheses, as shown here, Stoner 2020 described. Remember that if you directly quote the text, you also need to include locator information to help your reader find the direct quote in its original context. For a book with page numbers, that locator information is usually a page number. So we could put Stoner 2020 described context as the relevant and significant social conditions, needs, or symbols which serve as guidelines for interpreting messages. And then we could just put page 49 in parentheses at the end with a P followed by a period and then the number. However, we have a little bit of a special case here in that we may want to focus on specific chapters of the book. So APA gives you a way that if you want to tell the professor with a spotlight, hey, I used chapter 4, or hey, I used chapter 5, you can also include that in the locator information for a direct quote. So we could put Stoner 2020 described context as direct quote. And then you could put chapter 4, comma, and then page 49 in the parentheses at the end. Obviously, since we're focused on a podcast here, you're going to need to cite the podcast on which your assignment is based. So to write this reference, we first put the name of the podcast host, last name, comma, first and middle initials. Here we have Perry Giles, comma, T, period. Then we put the word host in parentheses with a capital H. Then you're going to put as much date information as you have available. For a podcast, you can usually find the month, day, and year. When you have all three of these elements for the reference, you format the date with the year first. So we have 2021, comma. Then we spell out the month, January, and then we put the day, 28. Next, you write the title of the podcast episode. This is in sentence case, so we're only going to capitalize the first word, inaugural. After that, you put the phrase audio podcast episode in square brackets, and we're only going to capitalize the A. And because a podcast episode is part of a series, we also need to identify the name of the podcast itself. So we put the word in to show that the episode is in a larger series. Then we put the title of the podcast in italics. Communication Matters, the NCA podcast. This time, since the series is considered a standalone entity, we format the title in regular title case. That means that you capitalize all the major words. So we have the C, the M, the T, NCA, and the P in podcast all capitalized. Then we put the name of the publisher, National Communication Association, and this is online, so we're going to put a URL. Make sure the URL begins with https://. To cite a paraphrase of information from the podcast, you could use the host's last name and the year, which would be Perry Giles, comma, 2021. If I want to identify the person who was speaking in the podcast, we can put their name in the sentence. So here I'm talking about Murphy. So I can put Murphy remarked that Biden's approach to blah, blah, blah. Then I could put the Perry Giles citation at the end. If we want to directly quote, as we have here, we also need to include the locator information. So Murphy remarked that Biden's approach to covenant renewal discourse dresses up a progressive program in conservative clothing. Perry Giles, 2021, 23 minutes, 20 seconds. So we need this timestamp at the end to tell the reader the second in the podcast when the quote began. And again, the language in my sentence identifies who the speaker was. If you need additional help with referencing, you are welcome to visit the APA website. They have an excellent series of pages that basically show you how to write every reference that you would ever need to write. So you can click this link here to get to the APA website, and you of course can also email us at the Online Writing Center at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. So this concludes our discussion of describing and analyzing rhetoric. Today we reviewed key concepts and texts to understand the purpose and process of rhetorical analysis, and we workshopped APCO 311 Week 2 Assignment 1, Understanding and Evaluating Rhetorical Analysis and Description. So before we go, let's talk a little more about the services we provide in the Online Writing Center. You can check out the Online Writing Center homepage in My ACU through this top link. You can watch the video linked here for the steps to make an appointment and submit a paper. We work with you at any stage of your writing, and we do offer two types of appointments. You can make an email/asynchronous appointment where you upload your paper and we send you feedback by email within 24 hours. That email is usually titled the Writing Center Report. Or you can also make a Zoom appointment where you can talk with one of our tutors in real time. And then at the time of the appointment, you just go to the schedule, click on the link, and you are connected. Keep in mind that all these appointments are in Central Time. You can also access many writing related resources on our Online Writing Center website. For both asynchronous or email asynchronous and Zoom appointments, we have the same process. You can schedule an appointment at WC Online and then upload your paper to the appointment form. If you don't have a paper for a Zoom appointment, that's okay. But if you do want to bring a paper or a work product to a Zoom appointment, try to upload your paper an hour or two before the appointment so that the tutor can have some time to look at it first and make best use of your appointment time. Here's our contact information again. You can email us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can click the second link to schedule an appointment, or you can visit our Online Writing Center website. We have a load of resources on our website, including our APA course paper template, which we mentioned earlier. We have a YouTube channel on YouTube where you can find a lot of our webinars and other videos about writing. And we have an Online Writing Center blog, which is recently being populated with some entries about AI and writing, so you may want to check those out. If you're interested in learning more about rhetorical analysis, you may want to check out the next installment of our rhetorical analysis series, which we're going to release virtually on July 9th. I'm promoting our work. In that webinar, Tanya and I, again, yay, will explore how to craft a detailed deep dive rhetorical analysis through the lens of APCO 311's Week 3 Assignment 1, Rhetorical Interpretation and Evaluation, the big so what of rhetorical criticism. And we're also going to talk about how to cite TED Talk videos in that one. So this concludes the first of our two webinars on writing rhetorical analysis. I thank you all for learning with us today, and I thank you, Tanya, for teaching me so much and being just a really engaging speaker.
Thank you so much, Emmy, for being the Sherlock Holmes and the backbone of the Online Writing Center. You guys have got this, okay? Rhetorical analysis, describe, analyze, interpret, evaluate. Go knock it out of the park. We'll talk to you next week.
Yay. Thanks, Tanya.